Our guest today is president and a board member of the Joyce Foundation. The Joyce Foundation has assets of $800 million and makes grants of roughly $40 million each year. The mission of the Joyce Foundation is to improve the quality of life in the Great Lakes region. Our guest today holds an honors degree in English from Brown University and an MBA from Northwestern Kellogg. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome back to the City Club of Chicago, Ellen Alberding. Ellen? Thank you. Have fun up here.
Thank you. I want to thank Jay for that nice introduction and thank all of you for coming out on this rainy day. I especially want to give a shout out to the staff of the Joyce Foundation who are sitting right here in about the middle of the room. Great job. I also want to thank my sister, my husband, and my mother for coming out, especially because they can hear me spout off just any time for free. So here they are. I think they deserve a round of applause for that. I was here last March, and it was just at the dawn of the Emanuel administration. We had a sense of new beginnings and really high hopes for the future, but we were also really aware of some of the big challenges that we have in our education system and in our public safety, as well as our economic condition. I know you've had some really fabulous speakers since then, but one of them is my good friend and partner, Cheryl Hyman. She was here a couple weeks ago, I guess, and I don't know if anybody in the room heard her speak, but she is fabulous, and she's doing a fabulous job. Cheryl's here with Laurent Pernot, but there's a big team standing behind her trying to do something that's really difficult, which is to turn around the massive city colleges system, which, in case you don't know, has about 125,000 students. It's one of the largest community college systems in the country, and it's had some really, really tough challenges. I first became involved when Martin Cabrera, who's also here, was the board chair, and he was a wonderful help for me as I became vice chair of the board in understanding what the challenges were, which included a 7% graduation rate. You heard that right. And so you can see what a huge challenge that Cheryl and her team have. She's implementing a turnaround plan, which we all call the reinvention plan, that's already had some great results. They've got the graduation rate up 3 percentage points in a very short period of time, so it's now 10%. And on May 12th, there will be more than 2,000 students walking across the podium and receiving a certificate or diploma from Cheryl, which is the highest number of graduates in more than 10 years. So we're very, very proud of that success. One of the things that I always struggle with as a foundation leader is, what does a foundation actually do? And when I look at leaders like Cheryl, and I look at Jean-Claude Brizard, and I look at Gary McCarthy, you know, people who are every day waking up and facing these enormous challenges and making change, trying to make change, having some successes, and you know, not every day, but they are doing stuff every day. So when I think about how to describe what we do, sometimes it's challenging until I realize, oh, the reinvention plan, we funded that. We made it possible for the research and evaluation that lies underneath the changes that Cheryl is making to happen. We had and still have a wonderful staff person, Whitney Smith, who has this great combination of knowledge and persistence. She is a terrier who sinks her teeth in an issue and will not let go until it's fixed. And it's that kind of work that I think really best describes what a foundation can do. So it doesn't really come naturally to us to toot our horn. We are behind the scenes a lot of the times, and that's where we should be, but we are doing the kind of work that we hope makes it possible for good public policy to be implemented. To that end, I wanted to talk to you about a couple of actual successes we've had this year. Since I have the mic, I'm not going to talk about the flops, but you can ask me about those later if you really insist. Jay has already done a nice job of describing who we are. We've got about 800 million in assets. We give away 40 million a year, and we're focused on a range of public policy issues. I've been president of the foundation for 10 years now, which actually sort of shocked me when I realized that. Some of my friends in the back of the room are rolling their eyes. That's been a long time. But I think I have some ideas about what makes us successful or what makes things work for us that I want to outline. First is to participate. It's really important to me, and it's important to our staff, that we can, we have a degree of expertise in the fields that we work in, and none of us are afraid to roll up our sleeves and really dive in and get to work on specific issues. Second is to be curious. It's tempting for all of us to stick with the tried and true, but a foundation has the resources and the perspective to take the long view and to listen to new ideas, to listen to the things even that are, you know, way on the outside edge of what's currently being talked about. I think it's our responsibility to take advantage of that freedom and to take chances and ideas that can lead to better outcomes in these complex systems that we're working in. The third is to be patient. We try to give things time to work. We let projects play out before we make judgments. I'm sure everyone in this room has had something they've worked on that looked great at the beginning and then faded away or flopped. And the opposite, things that don't look like they're going to really work out so well, but if you give them time, you give them support, they prove to be some of the best projects around. And fourth is to pay attention and to make changes when necessary. So we really invest a lot in research and evaluation, both of other people's programs and our own, and through that, we think we can learn what investments pay off and which ones don't. We try to be open to mid-course corrections, to criticism, and to understanding how we can do our work better, but we want it to be with good research and evaluation. So I want to talk today about a couple of issues. I'm going to start with the environment program, which is one of our largest programs. I'm going to talk a little bit about guns, and then I'm going to go into education. That I can't cover all of our programs in one talk, and maybe I'll come back and talk about the other ones next time. Here's a specific project that we put about $1 million into, which was to build the case to clean up or close 2 coal-fired power plants that sit inside the city of Chicago. They're called Crawford and Fisk. They're generating stations. They generate electricity by burning coal, which presents obviously real threats to people's health because it contaminates the air and it pollutes the water by releasing mercury, sulfur dioxide, and soot. It's very rare these days to have coal-fired power plants sitting right inside a city, in a neighborhood, but that's the situation that we have. On the right, you can see the Fisk plant, and Crawford is similarly located right in a neighborhood. Fisk is sitting on the river, which adds particular problems. We partnered with a whole bunch of groups on this issue over a decade. We worked with the Clean Air Task Force, NRDC, the Respiratory Health Association, the Illinois Environmental Council, and there were many others involved as well, to argue that if these plants could not be modernized, if we couldn't fix how they worked, then they needed to be shut down. Earlier this year, Mayor Emanuel and Midwest Gen owns these plants. They've reached a deal, finally, to close the plants down after decades of fighting about it. It was thanks to the mayor's insistence, and we know he is not a patient man, and that's to our benefit a lot of the time. But it's also because of the science and fact-based arguments of our grantees who made the case slowly over time about the health implications of having these plants in these neighborhoods. Fisk will close in September, and Crawford is going to close shortly thereafter. I'm very, very excited about that and proud of our role. It's children who are mostly affected. They're disproportionately poor children, and they suffer terribly from asthma and other impacts of these plants, and they will be the beneficiaries. Now, it being Chicago, you can imagine there are many opinions about what should be done with the land that these plants sit on, you know, what happens next. on my right on the slide, Jeannie Gang, the wonderful Chicago architect, has been very interested in this problem, and she has sketched out an idea on how you could actually turn the Fisk generating plant into, she's got a harbor and lots of parkland, interesting set of ideas. There are lots of other ideas on the table. There's going to be a lot of community engagement. The mayor is very focused on making sure there's community engagement in the decision making. The Sierra Club and the Delta Institute will partner with us and our funding to make some suggestions over the next several months on that. Another big environmental project for us has been our work to prevent the spread of Asian carp. So all of you have heard a little bit about Asian carp. Here's a good illustration of what they look like. There's some really amazing, this is YouTube, but there's some YouTube videos that actually have no sound, like it's really gross. I didn't want to do that to you over lunch, especially since we're having fish. But the threat that these fish play in our communities is pretty serious, because they breed really prolifically, and they eat all the little creatures that all the other fish depend on. So you've got a threat to the water, that 30 million Americans depend on the water in the Great Lakes. You've got a threat to the $7 billion fishing industry. So it's not, this is not a trivial matter. And of course, if they have a negative impact on the water, all of us who like to run, bike, or just have a picnic near the lake will be impacted by this pending disaster. So we are leading an effort to do something about that. And when I say we, I really mean Molly Flanagan, who is our fabulous staff leader on that, who's sitting at the table over here. Molly is, again, an extremely knowledgeable and extremely persistent person and has done a lot of work on this issue. The place that Asian carp are most likely to get into the Great Lakes is right here in Chicago. There is a plan that's been put together by a couple of our grantees, paid for by us, support from Governor Quinn and Mayor Emanuel, to figure out how to not only stop Asian carp, but also improve water quality, reduce basement backups and flooding, and improve transportation. Right now we have, it's expensive, but it's also necessary. We'll see how this goes. But the point of our report was to demonstrate that it's doable and to put some pressure on the Army Corps of Engineers and other decision makers to say, you can do this, it's urgent, you have to do it. And already we've gotten some good responses on that. The Army Corps has said that they will speed up their process, although, as Molly points out, they have not said how quickly they will speed it up. But, we feel pretty good about what we've done on that. Let me make a switch to talk a little bit about gun violence, because I have a hard time getting up in front of this group and not talking about gun violence. Nothing is more essential to the vitality of our city than a sense of public safety and the reality of public safety. So both how we feel about it and what the reality is. Last year, when the Illinois House of Representatives took up the issue of whether to allow the concealed carry of weapons, there was a protester who stood outside the House with a sign that said, 49 states can't be wrong. To that sentiment, I would respectfully say, I'm proud that this is an area in which Illinois is an outlier. We are the only state in the United States that does not allow concealed carry, and I'm proud that our elected officials were able to beat that law back, and I hope they continue to be able to be strong in the face of a lot of pressure to change it. I suppose you could call that, thank you. That's a victory of sorts, but there's still a huge amount of work that needs to be done on this issue. It's been a terrible year on that front in Chicago, as you've all read, I'm sure. There was a 60% increase in murders in the first quarter in Chicago. We've got a terrific superintendent in Gary McCarthy, and we've got a lot of confidence in his ability to move forward on this issue, but he can't do it alone. He needs support. It might surprise you, because it actually surprised me to understand that most crime guns recovered in Chicago are actually from other parts of Illinois. They're not all coming from Mississippi and other states. And I mention that because it's important to understand that because we focus on state-level policy, and state-level policy really matters because how the state regulates access to guns has an impact on how easy it is for somebody to get a gun here in Chicago. Joyce is going to continue to work on a couple of issues. One of them is background checks on gun purchases. 40% of all gun purchases are private transfers, or they can be at a gun show or a private transfer of another sort. Those gun sales do not require a background check. That's 40% of all of the gun transfers in the state of Illinois. It strikes us as a little silly that to go buy Sudafed, you need to show ID. But you don't need to show ID and have a background check to buy a gun. So that's an issue that we hope the state legislature will take up. There's some other ideas on the table this session, including a gun registry and an ammunition tax. All of these things are important to reducing violence and reducing access to guns, and the Joyce Foundation will be continuing to support nonprofit organizations, nonpartisan organizations that are working on this issue. Let me switch gears again, though, to talk about another of the Foundation's top priorities, which is primary and secondary education. I was so pleased to hear Treasury Secretary Tim Geithner in a speech last month at the Economic Club when he emphasized the link between economic status and education as major barriers to student success. Secretary Geithner said, "A child's economic background and the color of her skin largely determine the quality of her education and her success in life." I thought that it was notable that of all of the pressing issues that the United States Secretary of the Treasury wanted to focus on, that he chose to focus on the achievement gap as a primary inhibitor to the growth of the economy and health of our country. Look at the numbers here in Chicago. If you start with the fact that about half of all 9th grade CPS students drop out of high school, and then you look at the remaining 50% who actually take the ACT, you can begin to see the magnitude of the problem. About half of the wealthier children in Chicago, which is the bottom bar chart, in the top bar chart there, demonstrate that they're ready for college in reading and math by scoring a 22 or higher on the ACT. Those of you who have high school students know that 22 is not exactly shooting the lights out on an ACT score. Only 15% of poorer children score a 22 or higher on the ACT, which means that 85% of the city's poorest children are not college ready in reading and math in the 11th or 12th grade. And these are only the children who make it that far. So if you look at the numbers broken down by race, which is the bottom bar chart, the story is very similar. White children do notably better, while Black and Latino children lag far behind. This is not the America that any of us want to live in. It's not fair to the kids who are being shortchanged. It's not who we are or who any of us want to be. The good news is, though, that we do know one solution. The most important thing, and the research is absolutely clear, that the most important thing that can happen inside the school is to have a high-quality teacher. A teacher who is successful at promoting student learning. If children who are behind have a high-quality teacher for 3 years in a row, the achievement gap snaps shut and they have a shot at success. That's why the Joyce Foundation is focusing on teacher quality. The research says it's the most important thing we can do, and there are things that we can do to address it. But the system that we have today often prevents that from occurring. It's a disconnect that I wanted to talk about by talking about two teachers. And I've given you a brochure that you can all take away. You don't need to read it now, but it's sitting on your chair. Maybe you're sitting on it. Maybe it's in front of you now. So imagine two teachers. Both are well-liked. They work hard. They're good people. But the students in one classroom are falling behind while the students in the other classroom are doing great. What makes the difference? Well, we know what makes the difference. The teacher in the struggling classroom was probably hired after the year started. She doesn't know the school well. She doesn't get coaching from either the principal or other teachers. Even though her students struggle, she gets rated an excellent. In fact, a stunning 91% of Chicago teachers were given a rating of excellent or superior in a 2009 study. And these ratings come despite the fact that the principal spends little time with the teacher, doesn't know whether her instruction is helping the students grow, and actually the students aren't doing any better. After a few years, this teacher is almost automatically given tenure, which means she has permanent job security. And not only that, but her pay keeps rising every year because salary is linked to seniority, not to student outcomes. The other teacher is a completely different story. She was hired early, probably, before the beginning of the school year. She knows the strengths and weaknesses of her students before she walks into the classroom on the first day. She's got a good relationship with her principal, and the principal spends time with her watching her teach. They sit down regularly and spend time talking about where she's strong and also map out a plan for how to improve her teaching over time. At this school, master teachers are advising her, and particularly with how to help struggling students. And when the year ends, her students are doing much better. She has an incentive to work hard to improve even further since her salary increases as her students do better. And perhaps more importantly, she can improve without the anxiety of being laid off because the school considers quality, not just seniority, if cutbacks are needed. These aren't hypothetical situations. There is research and practice that shows how we can put in place the conditions for getting that second high-achieving school. The success of that second teacher, that's our goal. That's where we want to go. And you probably won't be surprised to know that we believe that the ingredients that will make that happen are policy, and that's where we're spending our time. I want to talk a little bit about where Illinois is, because Illinois has made some huge progress, and so there's a lot of potential. The Illinois legislature have supported 2 new laws that say that student performance must be factored into teacher evaluations, which gives performance evaluation teeth. And next year, Chicago Public Schools will take a huge step and will implement a new teacher evaluation system. Sorry, there are two laws, both of which address student performance and incorporating student performance into teacher evaluations. The public schools are going to roll out a whole new system to every single school, which is going to evaluate teachers based on student academic growth. That's going to be 25% of a teacher's evaluation. There's also going to be in-class observation of a teacher, which will count for 50% of the teacher evaluation. And students are going to have a voice in this too, which I think is really interesting, given that I know my own students always had a lot of opinions about their teachers, and figuring out how to incorporate student voices into teacher evaluation I think is going to be a tricky but very interesting aspect of the new system in Chicago. Rolling it out, which they will do, I think the biggest issue they're going to have to deal with, and Jean-Claude and his team are going to have to deal with, is fairness. How do you do this in a way that's respectful to the incredibly hard work the teachers are doing and is fair, that the measures are fair to the teachers accept them, and that we have a system that both encourages excellence but also isn't appearing to be punishing teachers. So there's a whole lot of issues related to that. I've laid out a bunch of things here. There are other issues that we work on. I feel like for us to get up every morning, for my team to get up every morning and be excited about what they do, and for so many people in the room who I know are engaged in these issues, it really requires a dose of optimism every day. I wanted to close with some audio tape. I think some of you are familiar with the group StoryCorps. But if you're not, let me just explain that StoryCorps collects interviews with people, and in this case, which often air on National Public Radio, but are also part of a large archive of personal histories. They're doing a project across the country, but particularly in the Midwest, funded by the Joyce Foundation, where they're having young students interview their teachers and ask their teachers questions. And I've got some samples from that project, which I'd like to play.
What's an example of something you've done in the classroom that really motivated your students?
What was your motivation to becoming a teacher?
Tell me about a time when teaching made you feel hopeful.
The fact that we have a national conversation going on right now about not being satisfied with how education has always been done, but needing to take it to a much higher, much more professional level, ensure that every single student, regardless of race, regardless of living location, regardless of community, regardless of religion, has access to the best education our country can provide, makes me extremely hopeful.
I thought that was a wonderful interview, and there are hundreds more like it. It makes me feel hopeful to hear those comments, and I hope it makes all of you hopeful as well. There's a professor at the Harvard Business School who is always counseling people who are struggling with tough problems, and her quote is, "Everything feels like a failure in the middle. Keep going." That's my feeling for all of us in this room and for the Joyce Foundation. We're going to keep going, and hope you will too, and I appreciate your time and attention. Hope to see you again.
Are there any questions? I'll take those. So Ellen, while we're waiting for a few more questions to come up, one of the things that I really appreciated about philanthropy the couple of years that I spent doing it was that there were times when projects we invested in didn't work, and you mentioned the flops. Can you tell us a little bit about, what are the flops? When do you decide that, wow, we're going to pull back from this and go on to another priority?
We had a huge investment in a project called the Transitional Jobs Research Demonstration Project. We were very interested in what could be done to help men coming out of prison have a higher success rate at getting jobs. And we invested about $15 million ourselves and solicited support from both state budgets and other foundations to do a 5-site demonstration project where we were experimenting with high-touch support systems for men coming out of prisons, and it did, the long story short, we did a long-term evaluation of the efforts that our grantees were very invested in and working so hard on, and it turned out that the results were not that great. So we knew pretty early on in the evaluation that it was going to be kind of a mixed bag, but the longer the evaluation went on, the bag became less and less mixed, shall we say, and the results just weren't that strong. So what we had to struggle with, and we worked with Jaskulka Turman on this very closely, thank you very much for your help on it. What we had to struggle with it was complicated because we had our grantees who were spending their lives and putting blood, sweat, and tears. They cared so much about what they were doing. They had really invested, many of them their whole careers in working on these programs. On the other hand, we had data that we felt really showed that people shouldn't be investing in these types of programs over the long run. And what we chose to do was to release the data. We did a tour around the Midwest in all of the sites that, again, Jaskulka Turman did a great job helping us with. And we talked privately with the people who would be most interested in the results in each of the regions. We didn't make a big PR push, didn't put out a news release, but we spread the information very widely. It was on our website. We also spent a lot of time with the United States Department of Labor, they were very, very interested in the results of this. And I can tell this story without too much pain because there was a really fabulous outcome, which is that the Department of Labor, when they looked at the data, saw enough areas that they wanted to pursue. They saw enough potential for new programming ideas that they have subsequently issued an RFP and put tens of millions of dollars into further understanding how to address the concerns and challenges of this particular population of people, mostly men. So, it's a good news, bad news story, and it was one that we worked really hard to both, we had an obligation to share the data, we had an obligation to our grantees to be sensitive to their concerns, And we had the relationships in the Department of Labor to tell the story to them in a way that was persuasive and has resulted in some really interesting new funding opportunities. We also decided that that was a good time for us to wind down our engagement in that issue, which had been one we had put a lot of time and money into over time, and we've moved on to other things.
Thank you. We've got quite a few questions about education. I'll kind of alternate those. This next question is from Alderman Joe Moore. What's your view of the role of test scores in evaluating teacher and school performance? What is your view of the longer school day that's being proposed?
Well, test scores have to be part of the evaluation. I mean, you have to be able to evaluate student performance in some way. There's a lot of, when I was talking about fairness earlier on, there's a lot of concern about how do you measure fairly the growth of students in a classroom, and that there is both an art and a science to that, but test scores will certainly be part of the story. Longer school day has become kind of a flashpoint here in Chicago and somewhat of a political conversation, but I think there's really no doubt that having longer time on task and longer high-quality day is something that we really need to strive for. We have one of the shortest school days in the country. I think simply lengthening a school day that isn't a good school day is not the answer, though. It needs to be high quality. And so that's what I'd say about that, Alderman. I'm sure we could extend the conversation elsewhere.
That could be another session. We know that could be another session, but thank you. This next question is from Peter Benzinger. Peter is a former vice president of the City Club back from the 1970s. Thank you for your longevity, Peter. He's co-chair of Change Illinois. I'm going to read it as is. Illinois legislators owe allegiance to party leaders. Would it be helpful to have legislative districts drawn independently rather than having legislative leaders pick their voters, as is the case now in Illinois?
Thank you, Peter. As Peter knows, we are big supporters of Change Illinois, and we are big supporters of redistricting reform. We have a wonderful new staff person that actually, if you would just stand for a minute, George Chung is running our Money in Politics program, and he is just started and will be very engaged in this issue in all of our states. I don't want to comment on a specific proposal, Peter, but we think there needs to be some really big changes in how redistricting happens, and there are a lot of different ways to skin the cat, but until you figure out a solution to that, I think a lot of the other problems that we have will not be fixable.
Thank you, Ellen. Another question here about public safety from Jeffrey Collard, Haymarket Center. There's an enormous amount of data linking substance abuse with crime, and an enormous amount of data showing that substance abuse treatment works. Yet the state continues to cut treatment funding and foundations are not filling the void. What can we do to help funding follow the data in this area?
Well, funding, our funding follows the data in the areas in which we work. I do think that on substance issues, if you listen to Gary McCarthy, it's gangs and drugs are the major cause of a major factor in the level of violence and gun crime in our city. And so we understand that. We don't have any, the Joyce Foundation doesn't work in that field at all, so I just don't have any expertise to really address that question in a substantive way, other than to say we do think it's a huge issue and it needs to be addressed. But we don't fund in the healthcare arena at all.
Thank you, Ellen. Here's another question about education from Glenn Mazad, RBS Citizens, Charter 1. What are your suggestions for younger teachers that are experiencing the issues you spoke of, principal not engaged, no active coaching, input, etc.? How can they help to bring about change? What can be done in these districts?
One of the things that Joyce has made a big effort on in the last couple of years is to figure out ways to raise the voices of teachers who are not necessarily being represented, their voices aren't being heard. You hear the union voices, but often that's about labor negotiations, or you know, that's when they're loudest. But we're really interested in how do you gather teachers who are concerned about conditions in their own schools, see other kinds of solutions other than the ones that are talked about in the newspaper necessarily. So we are investing in ways to raise those teachers' voices up. And on the specifics, you know, I think there are organizations that try to work with teachers in different schools, many of which are in Chicago, and many of which we fund. So the resources are out there. You just might have to work to find them a little bit.
Here's a question about the environment from Steve Frankel, Midwest Director, Union of Concerned Scientists. The end of federal stimulus, the recession, and historically low natural gas prices threaten our transition to a clean energy economy that relies more on renewable energy and energy efficiency. How is the Joyce Foundation responding?
The other part of our environment portfolio, which I didn't really talk about, I'm sorry, Steve, but you know that we're really interested in energy efficiency, and we're putting a big push on energy efficiency both at the state level and at the municipal level. So you'll hear a lot more about that from us as we begin to roll out our grant making in that arena over the next 6 to 9 months.
2 more questions. How many more could we take? Okay. This is from Sean McCready. It's about education, board member at St. Agnes of Bohemia School. Small and innovative independent schools are often able to implement change quickly, but have the least access to foundations and the least mobilization for policy advocacy. How does your foundation work with these schools?
I can give you a specific example as it relates to charter schools, because we looked at that. We've been longtime supporters of choice and charters in general. I mean, for 20, 25 years, Joyce has been on that issue. But we're not supporting individual charter schools. How do we synthesize and wrap up the power of charter schools and let them have a voice in the policy arena? So we have funded the Illinois Network of Charter Schools, the whole point of which is to get charter schools' voices put together in a way where they do have a more powerful impact in the policy discussion. Now, independent schools that are, you know, we don't work outside of the publicly funded systems, so independent schools, I understand, would have the same kind of issue, but they might want to look at a model like the Illinois Network of Charter Schools as a way of having a voice in the policy arena. I also got a note earlier from Gretchen Crosby Sims on our team. There's a guy named Rick Hess who works at the American Enterprise Institute, which is a conservative think tank in Washington. And he was writing about what should foundations do in education. And he was quoting a researcher who pointed out that less than 1% of all education funding is from foundations. And that includes the giants. You know, that includes Gates and everyone else all wrapped up. So Rick Hess's point, which I 100% agree with, is that foundations have got to focus on high leverage policy, because otherwise it's just spreading it around in a way that is not going to have an impact. And I thought that was a very nice reinforcement of what really underlies the foundation's approach to grant making in general and why we focus on policy.
So Ellen, one last question, the one that many in the room are waiting to ask. This is from Dr. Pius, President, HFC Hospitality and Entrepreneurship Training Center. They specialize in adults with challenged backgrounds, ex-offenders, men and women. We have excellent outcomes. Who can I contact at the Joyce Foundation to inquire about funding?
You know, I knew that was what it was all about. You know, anybody who wants to write me a note, I mean, I can be the, I can take the incoming and direct any questions that you might have about specifics to the folks on our team, and I can assure you you'll get a prompt response.
Thank you very much, Ellen Alberding. Thank you.